Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, the casting of Frank Stone, and the potential and problems of adding Frank Stone, the champion, to Dead by Daylight as a licensed killer. He is a licensed killer, right? The casting of Frank Stone is an interesting landmark in the history of Dead by Daylight. Behaviour has tried several times since DBD's release to expand out of Dead by Daylight's shadow with games like Islands of Insight and Meet Your Maker, but Frank Stone is the first time that shadow has spread beyond behaviour itself, and has been outsourced to another game studio. Supermassive Games, the British studio behind Until Dawn and the Dark Pictures anthology, and currently working on Little Nightmares 3, developed the casting of Frank Stone, which was released in the summer of last year. Set in the Dead by Daylight universe, the casting of Frank Stone is a narrative single-player game in Supermassive's house style, following the entity reaching out into the world through its operative on Earth, Dr. Augustine Lieber. And the two groups of people in 1980 and 2024 caught up in her schemes, as they understand the mystery and the truth behind the game's title character. When Frank Stone released to mixed receptions from Supermassive fans and DBD players alike, it quickly became clear that the game was made for a very specific audience. There's good news and bad news about that. Good news, I am definitely part of that audience. I loved the casting of Frank Stone. It felt like a super authentic expansion of DBD's universe with some fun characters that gave us a really compelling look at the entity's influence on a small scale. But the bad news is that audience was basically nobody else. A lot of non-Dead by Daylight players found the constant allusions and references to the source material to be cloying and alienating, and many DBD fans didn't like being winked and nudged constantly to go look at this thing that they might recognise. It didn't help the optimization was terrible, at least at the start, and a lot of players felt lied to by how inflexible the ending was. The marketing led people to assume their choices would outright change the ending wholesale, while the truth was more in the traditional Supermassive fashion, where you could choose who survived, but the story path itself was fairly rigid. But regardless of your opinion on the game, the mere existence of the game as part of DBD's universe gave rise to a question that people were asking as soon as it was announced, and are still asking now. Could we someday get Frank Stone as a killer? That's what we're talking about today. We're putting the casting of Frank Stone through its paces to see if the title character has what it takes to become a killer in the fog. His lore and backstory, his relationship with the entity, and his power set. We're doing the whole shebang. We'll also be going through the game's cast of characters to find a potential survivor or two to accompany him into the fog. And, as traditional for these videos, we're wrapping up with a power concept for Frank Stone. This is going to be a long one, but it's a licensed character, with a pretty complicated backstory set in the Dead by Daylight universe. How could I resist? The casting of Frank Stone's story is told across 3 different time periods: 1963, 1980, and 2024. And Frank Stone is one of the 2 characters that we see in all 3 eras, the other being the police officer Sam Green. Frank changes a lot, from this trapper-ass bloke in a welding mask in 1963, to this skeleton man in 1980, to this sexy beast in 2024, often aren't immediately obvious without playing through the game yourself, and finding all the documents and artifacts that help you put the pieces together. As far as anyone could tell, Frank Stone was an ordinary guy, who worked at the Cedar Steel Mill in Cedar Hills, Oregon. Frank Stone wasn't his full name. In 1980, you can find a letter from his out-of-town grandmother which affirms his real name is Franklin Norman Stone. That early letter tells us a lot about Frank's psyche and background before his transformation into a killer. He lived under the thumb of his grandmother, who was clearly not the most stable and sane lady. She tried to cultivate paranoia, social attachment, and disdain for others into Frank, but it's unclear how well that worked. Frank's letter asserts that he struggled to make friends in Cedar Hills, but there wasn't anything to suggest that he was troublesome at the mill, at least not until the nightmares started. Frank was plagued by visions of pain and suffering, and an overwhelming sense of dread. He sees some great abomination that seems to hold his life in its clutches. He dreams of a world a long way away, where he's soaked in the blood of innocence and kills and hunts in the night. This understandably caused him to seek out a psychotherapist, which would be a great idea if his therapist wasn't Dr. Augustine Lieber. Lieber is a Black Veil operative with a particular interest in Frank Stone's life and decides she's going to make his life much, much worse by actively pushing him down the path of the masked serial killer. With Augustine's pushing, Frank Stone increasingly embraced the entity and what it wanted him to be, and we can see the records of that in his notes. He modified a welding mask into the image of a savage beast, began experimenting with weapons to see which felt right in his hands, And before long, people in Cedar Hills started to go missing, including a baby. The year was 1963, and the Cedar Hills police officer Sam Green was investigating the missing baby who he feared would become the next victim in Frank Stone's killing spree. Sam Green confronts Frank Stone and, unless you fail your skill checks, ends up saving the baby while Frank Stone dies, impaled in a shard of metal in the Cedar Steel Foundry room. This, reasonably, should be the end of Frank. Being skewered on spikes and shit isn't exactly something you should recover from normally, but, you know, the game is named after him, so it shouldn't surprise you that Frank's legacy lingered long after his demise. Let's skip forward to 1980, after Cedar Steel has closed and decayed into disuse, and a bunch of amateur filmmakers are sneaking in to shoot. Murder Mill, produced by Chris, Jaime and Linda, is being filmed off the books on the Cedar Steel plant, and after the now sheriff Sam Green forces them off the property, they start to learn about Frank Stone and the history of bloodshed in their new movie set. And the story and legacy of Frank Stone becomes baked into the film's production. Even if the film's director Chris wasn't translating Frank to the screen directly, she was very heavily inspired by Frank's murders and took forensic interest in them and the news stories around them as she continued filming in the Cedar Steel mill. This got a little too forensic once they found stuff from Frank's killing spree, including several pages of notes and drawings, and most concerningly his hidden lair full of severed body parts. But as soon as they decide they've seen enough and that they're a bit out of their depth, they soon find themselves a lot out of their depth, because their meddling has not gone unnoticed. Through some weakness or overlap between this world and another, something coalesces from the deserted wreckage of the Cedar Steel mill. He's different. So very, very different than what we'd seen before, but we and the Murder Mill crew all recognise him from what he was before. Frank Stone, back from the dead. Well, bits of Frank Stone anyway. If 1963's Frank Stone was the man controlled first by his grandmother, then by Dr. Lieber, and finally by the entity, 1980's Frank Stone is a remnant of that man. A spectre that still haunts the steel mill, and when he sees the Murder Mill crew, he comes out swinging. As he demonstrates on Bonnie, Frank will kill or ritually sacrifice anyone who gets in his way, and the only way to stop him for good is the camera that Augustine herself sold to the group. The Spectre terrorizes the group, always killing Bonnie in every playthrough, but possibly killing Jaime, Sam and Linda too if you take the paths that get them killed. But whoever has that camera has the ability to withstand Frank's attacks. If the camera is used to record Frank's spectral form, it will absorb him little by little into the film inside the camera, until the culmination of the 1980 story sees him permanently bound to the Murder Mill film strip. Whoever does it doesn't really matter. Robert is the only one guaranteed to survive the night, so if nobody else lives to do it, then he will. But regardless, the film strip winds up being cut into pieces and squirreled away so that nobody can ever find it, and Frank Stone can never return. So of course, he returns after 40 years of absence, thanks to the long-term manipulation of his old therapist, Dr. Lieber. The 2024 storyline shows the final stages of her plan to recapture Frank Stone's essence and reconstitute his body. Not just the ones from the version 1980 that we've played, but dozens of different film strips from dozens of different universes, each with their own fragment of their own Frank Stone trapped inside. Each film strip is all but pickled in the eldritch energy that caused Frank to manifest into their world in 1980. Effectively dripping in the blood and suffering that Frank caused in his 1963 and 1980 killing sprees. When Augustine brings them all together, she creates in effect the ultimate compilation, layered up and smashed together like a collage to create the final iteration. Reborn in flesh, the final Frank Stone, the champion. Augustine's project was fully realised, and he wasted no time in preparing for what he was always born for, the shedding of innocent blood in sacrifice for the entity. When he leaves the movie screen in Garant Manor, someone in that room will always die. Who kicks the bucket is up to you, but even in the best case scenario, Frank is killing at least one person before you escape the manor house, and his career in bloodshed does not stop there. Augustine, and possibly Madison too, die brutally with the entity as Frank's witness, and he is taken into the fog to continue his work in his service. And thus the entity claimed Frank Stone, the champion, for its own. This is quite probably the longest I've ever spent covering the lore of a killer, and I still feel like I've skimmed through it, because Frank Stone is probably the most documented non-playable character in the history of DBD's universe, except the entity and maybe the Observer. And I say non-playable as in not playable so far, because the casting of Frank Stone is not at all subtle about the fact that his titular slasher is set up as a future killer for Dead by Daylight. His final form, as he appears in 2024, checks off every box a killer needs to occupy to truly belong in the fog. A kick-ass visual design that's distinct from every other killer in the game, a strong backstory that weaves him into the entity's world in a way that feels natural, and a snappy and distinct title in DBD's traditional naming convention, The Champion. Not to mention a bunch of other stuff attached to him from his origin game that seems just a little bit too conveniently laid out for us. For example, his kill in Augustine's home movie theatre is so obviously set up to be a future Maury for him. Somebody will always die in that theatre, and unless it's Stan, Frank's giant tummy mouth eats them alive, before their face grows on his body and he silences their scream by stabbing himself in the chest. How fucking metal is that? That kill is way too theatrical and way too consistent across all the potential victims to not be a giant red flashing light saying, "That's a Maury." And his dedicated soundtrack pieces and when he materialises fully as the champion are very telling. Every DBD killer released since Legion has had their own dedicated chase music, and Frank Stone literally has the champion's chase theme, already from his chase with Linda down the stairs. And the game's main theme remixes the DBD Dies Irae in a way that I could see adapted into Frank Stone lobby music, given that killer lobby music almost always includes the DBD Dies Irae as a variant into the killer's style. But the most telling part is his personal track, the Champion's theme, because already divided up into 3 pieces, like DBD's traditional Terror Radius structure. It has 3 distinct layers of music that get more frantic and intense as they go, and the killer approaches closer to a survivor. Listen to the Champion's theme, and then listen to the Terror Radius for Unknown or Skull Merchant that also has his clear divisions, and you will see what I mean. The Champion's theme starts off atmospheric and almost subtle, like the Outer Terror Radius themes, and switches to something more cinematic and ominous like a Terror Radius second layer, and then finally becomes tense and frantic as the killer is right on top of you. Intentionally or otherwise, Frank Stone is built to be a killer in every single detail. I know I've harped on a lot about the character's music, but I think it makes my point well, that Frank Stone is in every way made for Dead by Daylight, to the point that leaving him as a non-playable character would just feel wrong. He's even canonically in the fog already. He's seen the first 4 original survivors, and the game ends with him ready for a trial, for the first hunt to begin an eternity of bloodshed in the entity's service. The whole point of the casting of Frank Stone is that he ends up exactly where he's supposed to be, where he was explicitly and meticulously designed to be. And my favourite part of this intentionality is that it's canon to the game's events. Yes, Frank Stone as a character was designed by Supermassive and Behaviour to eventually become a killer in Dead by Daylight, but he was also designed for the entity's service as a killer in-universe by Augustine Lieber as her offering to the entity. It's a perfect synthesis between the narrative of Frank Stone's life and the meta-narrative of the casting of Frank Stone as a game, and its reasons to exist at all. Frank Stone is effectively the game's final boss, the big baddie whose name is on the box and the only person who gets a good deal out of the game's outcome. But he's not who I would consider the main antagonist of the game. That title goes to Dr. Augustine Lieber, whose shadow looms over the whole game as she attempts to please the entity through any means necessary. From what we see of her at the start of the game as the 2024 narrative pulls itself together, Augustine just kind of feels like a big entity fan whose house is full of artwork, relics and memorabilia of the entity and its killers. If you're just playing the game to play the game and not autistically navel-gazing like me, the cavalcade of references can be alienating to people who don't know DBD very well, or cloying to those who do. But it all makes a lot more sense when you realise who Augustine is. The entity is her entire life, and the people that act memorialised in Garant Manor aren't just fun tidbits with the players, but her tributes to them. They are the stained glass windows of saints and prophets in the cathedral to the entity that is Garant Manor, and that only becomes more obvious as the story continues. As we explore the manor with Maddie and Linda in 2024, the depths of Augustine's obsession stretch beyond human limitations and fascination, and into a plan that crosses timelines and universes. Her house contains a time machine, at least something that looks and acts like a time machine. that allows Augustine in 2024 to travel back to Cedar Hills during Frank Stone's lifetime up until 1963 and the recording of Murder Mill in 1980. The whole apparatus has lots of moving components and concentric loops of metal that work together in a way that resembles the Auris, the observer's technology that lets him pull objects' memories of different universes, so it might be safe to assume that Augustine's device works in a similar way. But this suggests something curious about the precise way that time travel works in the casting of Frank Stone, something supported by the rest of the game's approach to time travel and causality. Get your nerd glasses on, this is going to get weird. As the story goes on, a number of revelations come to pass that recontextualise exactly what Augustine is doing and how she's doing it. We learn that Maddie is Bonnie's daughter in 2024, and in her timeline Bonnie died only a few months before where we picked up the story. But in every playthrough of the 1980 story, Bonnie always dies at Frank Stone's hands, in 1980. This suggests that the 1980 and 2024 timelines are not causally linked. If the events of 1980 and 2024 were connected, then Maddie couldn't exist. There's lots of things that are incongruent between 1980 and 2024. The film Linda sees in 2024 isn't the same one we see them recording in 1980. Linda and Sam can die in 1980 while still being alive in 2024, and Linda even remarks that the Sam Green we see in 2024 can't be the same one we see in 1980. The game's three time periods are not causally linked, which means that calling Augustine's device a time machine isn't necessarily entirely accurate, because she's not using it to travel across a timeline. She's using it to travel between universes, with the time displacement being almost a side effect. If we start to think of Augustine's device as a dimension-hopping machine and not a time machine, then the story of Frank Stone feels a lot more fitting with Dead by Daylight established themes. Alternate universes and the blurring line between fiction and reality has been part of Dead by Daylight's story forever, really, and Augustine's intentionally making that line blurrier with every trip she takes, as she brings the version of Frank Stone that was committed to Chris's movie into the real world. Let me explain it like this. It's been established in DBD lore for a while now that the barrier between realities that keeps universes separate gets thinner at locations where great suffering has been felt. Strong emotions pool and eddy there, like water, through a physical manifestation known as auric particles. I think that's what Chris saw through the camera here when he looked at the site Frank Stone died in. She saw an overlap between realities, at the site where Frank caused and ultimately experienced huge amounts of pain. The overlap weakens the barrier between different dimensions, and this is where Augustine comes in, because she finds that worn down weak point in the Cedar Steel Mill and drives her dimension machine directly into it. Augustine appears at least twice in the history of Cedar Hills, first as Frank's therapist in the 1960s, and then as the curiosity shopkeeper in 1980. We can assume she used the dimension machine to do this. The dimension machine uses the same blue spectral lighting as Frank's spectral form, and Frank didn't awaken at Cedar Steel until the dimension machine was used to open a gateway to 1980. I believe Augustine chose the Cedar Steel plant in 1980 very intentionally, setting it to just the right place and time to punch through into the universe at the best moment for her plan to come to fruition. Her manipulation of Frank Stone weakened that barrier when he died in 1963. But it's the continued suffering of the Murder Mill crew in 1980, and especially the sacrifice of Bonnie at Frank's hands, that caused the auric particles to become sufficiently concentrated for Augustine to be able to use. The camera got soaked in these particles too. That's why it can contain Frank's spectral form on the film. But I believe it was Augustine's dimension machine punching a hole in reality that allowed the memory of Frank from 1953 to fully manifest itself. She manipulated Frank in the 60s to build up the suffering and create an overlap, and then broke through that overlap in 1980, creating a hole in the universe through which Frank's spectral form manifested and grew in power. And she did this over and over again. Different universes, different Franks, different murder mills, and different films on the other side that she compiled and refined to create the final Frank Stone. But that just leaves one question. Why did she do it? Why did Augustine spend all this time working on the perfect offering for the entity? Wouldn't a macaroni portrait or an Amazon voucher have been good enough? And more to the point, how does she know what the entity even is? Or how to create a dimension machine in the first place? Well, I've spoken to a lot of people about this, and everyone seems to either have never noticed the detail before, or think it's incredibly obvious to the point you have to be insane not to notice it, but Dr. Lieber is a Black Veil cultist. The Black Veil is an entity cult that exists in several different universes that seek power and enlightenment through following the entity and sacrificing victims to it. Lieber makes her home in 2024, in Maddie's universe, but there's no indication that that's where she started out. There are universes such as the Observer's universe where the entity is much better understood than ours, and Lieber claims that the name we know her by probably isn't her real one. As far as I can tell, Augustine comes from one of these universes, possibly the Observer's own dimension, judging by the similarity between her dimension device and the Aorist. And she's hiding out in 2024 on this bitch of an Earth because nobody here knows enough about the entity to be able to stop her until it's too late. According to Tory's law, the Black Veil believes the entity will guide its followers to power and enlightenment, and Augustine's actions seem to reflect that. The ending of the game suggests that Augustine expects some sort of reward from the entity for what she's done. Thanks to Tory giving us a bit of extra insight into the Black Veil's teachings, we can see why she was so keen to give it what it wanted. Unlike Tory, however, Augustine seems to have a good sense of what the entity wants and how it feeds on sacrifices that are offered to it. This can be attributed to the fact that she's probably from an advanced civilization that knows much more about the entity than Tory ever would. But even despite that, there's one important thing she misses, and that costs her dearly. Augustine knows what the entity feeds on and demands, and she thinks of herself as a chef, preparing Frankstone for the entity's plate like a gourmet meal made from only the best ingredients that she handpicked herself from dozens of different timelines, and she's mostly right. The only issue Augustine runs into is that she's not the chef she thinks she is. She's the appetizer. And that leaves her final fate, ambiguous, to say the least. Frankstone was masterfully crafted by Augustine Lieber to take up the role of a killer in the fog. I think I made my point here about how well Supermassive and Behaviour have woven this story into DBD's existing canon. The synthesis between DBD's universe and Supermassive's story is seamless, and it sets Frank perfectly up as a future killer for the fog. But the rest of the game comes with some questions about how best to adapt the casting of Frankstone in Dead by Daylight. While the killer pick is obvious to the point it's not really a pick at all, who to choose as a survivor from that game is far less clean cut. I've talked enough about Augustine Lieber at this point that you might think she's my choice for a survivor, and honestly, I think she's the one I'd be happiest to see. But that doesn't mean I think she'd be the right choice. Let me explain. Augustine is probably the most important character in Frankstone. She's the reason that everything happens, and she has hands down my favourite voice work in the whole game. Hannah Morrish is brilliantly theatrical. You can tell that she's a stage actress for the most part. And Lieber does wind up in the fog eventually. At least temporarily, her ring can be seen on a tree stump when you arrive, and she's given the final voiceover of the game in a way that implies that she's stuck in the fog too.
Whether killing or surviving, the entity will play with our souls for all eternity. An endless hunt of fear and hope, pain and sacrifice, from which even death is no escape.
But importantly, she's not at the campfire when the game wraps up. The post-credits scene shows her leaving a Horologium pod, helped out by an older version of herself. So she might have escaped the entity's realm by now already. In any case, having a second cultist survivor so quickly after the first survivor would feel kind of odd and be a disservice to the many other characters deserving a shot at the survivor slot. I think Augustine could provide a unique alternative role, but I'll get into that later. So who would I pick as a survivor? I think, similar to Tools of Torment and Stranger Things and Resident Evil chapters, Frankstone could get away with having two survivors, Sam Green and Linda Castle. These are the only characters aside from Lieber and Frank who we see two different versions of throughout the game, and both are central to the game's story on very personal levels. Sam Green is directly opposed to Frank in all three time periods. He's behind Frank's first death in 1963, takes him on again in 1980, and, if he survives the encounter, divvies up the film strips, and comes 2024 for one last-ditch attempt to stop Augustine from finishing her plans for him. Sam is consistently the only person who's portrayed as even capable of standing up to Frank. He's the cavalry that rocks up to take him on 1980 because after injuring him in 1963 and threatening a son in 1980, this is personal now. But if Sam is Frank's direct nemesis, then Linda is more of a mirror to Augustine. Both are creators behind their own murder mill productions, but while Linda is content to keep her horror stories on the film strip, Augustine has far greater ambitions. In Geraint Manor, Linda takes a leadership role quickly over the group, similar to the one that Augustine takes over Frankstone's life, and she's the most knowledgeable about what's going on at the manor, similar to how Augustine is most knowledgeable about the entity's nature and sacrifices that it demands. It'd be hard pushed for me to choose between Linda and Sam as the survivor of a Frankstone chapter, so why not both? Doubtless, if we only got one, we'd have legendary skins for the other, as well as maybe legendaries for the other members of the Murder Mill crew. Robert, Jaime, Chris and Bonnie. I know a Bonnie Legendary would be very popular among players, and adding Frank Stone's ensemble to the cast would definitely help DBD's lacking LGBT plus representation, with Bonnie as a confirmed lesbian, and Linda with some implications to that end as well. But for Augustine, I have something special in mind. She's not exactly killer material, but would also seem a bit out of place as a survivor. I think instead she belongs as a secret third thing. Anybody else remember that the Observer is basically buggered off? Like, he's safe now, but he's not back at his tower, meaning the narration for the tomes has jumped between several different readers. Sometimes it's Captain Pierce, the leader of the group currently residing in the Observer's tower, other times it's the Observer again, or James Rich, the screenwriter under Pierce's command, who named the tower the House of Arkham. One time that reader was Alan Wake, voiced by Matthew Herretta. But I think the archives are well and truly due a new permanent resident. The Observer's office is looking a bit untidy, and Augustine would be a perfect replacement for him, if not permanently, at least for a Frank Stone tome. She's got ideal credentials for this role. She's very knowledgeable about the entity and its inner workings, but in a completely different way to the Observers we've had before. She is intimately interested in the killers in the entity's service, and, her voice is brilliant, so I'd be down to hear her go through the memories of the survivors and killers in the fog. Behaviour? Get on the phone with Hannah Morrish already. You've got an absolute golden opportunity here. Please don't miss it. So we've got the cast of Frank Stone ready for the fog. But before I dig into my power concept for the killer, there's one very important question we need to answer. Would this ever actually happen? Yes. Yes, absolutely yes. Frank Stone Dead by Daylight is extremely likely, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if it was the next chapter after the FNAF release in the autumn of next year. It's so blatantly telegraphed that Frank Stone's natural fit into DBD's universe that many people expected Houndmaster to be Frank Stone instead, and was a little disappointed when he eventually got her. There are only really two potential issues with integrating Frank Stone into the game's cast, and thanks to an interview with the King and Paulie did with Matthew Cote a couple of months ago, we don't have to worry about one of those issues too much. My initial concern about Frank Stone coming to DBD was Supermassive playing ball. Since they made the game and not Behaviour, I assumed Supermassive would require Behaviour to pay royalties to bring the casting of Frank Stone to Dead by Daylight as a chapter. I made this point in a recent video I made detailing my wishlist for Dead by Daylight in 2025. But as a commenter pointed out, that may not be entirely true.
One question I want to know, because you are, the licensing guy. If Frank Stone, let's say, were to come into the game, I'm not going to spoil anything in Frank Stone, but let's say it were to come in, would that be considered a licensed chapter, or would that be an original chapter? How would that be evaluated?
That's a very good question. I think the only relevant part of that question is we wouldn't be paying royalties because it's our intellectual property. So
okay.
We own the property, right? It's ours. In this case, Supermassive, where the provider, we were the client, and that's how that relationship goes.
Got it.
Whether or not Behaviour themselves would count Frank Stone as an original character or as a licensed one, they wouldn't have to pay royalties or seek permission from Supermassive to do it, because they own the IP rights. Frank Stone as an intellectual property is as much Behaviour as Naughty Bear is, or DBD itself. But the IP rights aren't the only concern here. Yes, Behaviour owns the IP, but what does that mean for third-party assets contracted by Supermassive for use in the game? I'm talking mostly about voice acting and music here, because those weren't made in-house by Supermassive or by Behaviour. Supermassive contracted voice actors and composers to make sounds for the game, so would Behaviour own the rights to use those sounds because they own the IP? My first instinct is to say probably not. The whole thing reminds me of the rights issue around Hello Zep, the iconic Saw theme composed by Charlie Clouser for the use in the first Saw film, and reused for the other 9 in the series. Even though it's the theme for the Saw films, which are owned by Lionsgate, the music itself is owned by Charlie Clouser, not Lionsgate, who hold the Saw IP. That's why you can hear the track in trailers for some non-Saw movies, like 2008's Valkyrie.
I know.
Do you realize what you've done?
But not in some licensed Saw products like the DBD chapter. Clouser owns the rights, not the IP holders, and he decides what to do with them. And it might be the same thing with Frank Stone. I'm sure acquiring the rights for Behaviour wouldn't be much trouble with their influence and spending power, but it's something to bear in mind. Maybe they'd end up buying the tracks used in Frank Stone, or independently contracting the voice actors and composers, or just using VAs and the in-house composer Michelle April to replace or work with the Frank Stone cast and crew to fill out those gaps. It's a small hurdle, but definitely one worth bearing in mind, especially if Behaviour wanted full use of the exact tracks and voice actors used in the casting of Frank Stone. A more significant roadblock, then, is not the difficulty of making the chapter, but more likely the potential reward. Because as far as I can tell, the casting of Frank Stone was not a particularly popular game. The reception was, in general, not great. It didn't land with particular acclaim even among DBD's biggest fans, who you'd imagine would be its core audience. And while we don't have explicit sales figures for the game, something tells me if the game had sold really well, I'm sure we'd know about it. If Frank Stone is considered a licensed chapter and is therefore contending with the big profitable IPs that I'm sure are queuing out the door at Behaviour HQ, then it almost certainly got lost among that noise. What would Behaviour go for? A self-indulgent game made a year ago that not many people played or particularly liked, or a heavy hitter household name IP, like Dungeons & Dragons or Five Nights at Freddy's? It's not even up for consideration. If held in comparison to other licensed chapters, Frank Stone doesn't stand a chance of making it in until literally every license bigger than fucking Thanksgiving has already been done. But if Behaviour considers Frank Stone an original chapter because it's in their universe and they own the IP, the prospect suddenly looks a lot more attractive. While the name Frank Stone by itself won't be enough to sell 1 murder million copies, it'll hardly hurt the chapter's reputation compared to the complete unknown of a normal original chapter. Most of the issues people had with Frank Stone were stuff specific to the gameplay. Performance issues, limited choices, weird voice acting. But a DBD chapter doesn't have to worry about any of those things. If the idea behind it is solid enough to turn heads, it will find an audience if the chapter can stand on its own 2 feet. I think a lot of people who didn't enjoy playing the casting of Frank Stone or didn't buy it at all after all the bad press would still be hyped to see Frank Stone in the fog because his design and the theming of the game is what would carry the chapter, not the game itself. And Frank's design as the champion just goes really, really hard. But does the design as cool as Frank's translate into a fun power? We didn't get to see much of him actually doing killing in the proper game, especially once he becomes the champion, but I think I've come up with something that will make sense. Let me talk you through it. Frank Stone, otherwise known as the Champion, is a tall killer with a standard terror radius size and movement speed. His power is called Myth Given Life. The Champion can create up to 8 unholy sigils that are drawn on the map, slightly larger than Demogorgon portals. They take 2 seconds to place on the floor. Unlike demo portals, these can be placed with the edges slightly through walls, but the centre must be open for Frank to stand in. Frank has 2 powers that relate to these sigils, Trespasser and Soulfire Detonation. The Champion can teleport to any sigil on the map. When this teleport is used, the Champion immediately gets a blink that can only be used from inside the sigil. Think like a nurse's first blink. When Frank leaves the sigil by any means after using his teleport, that sigil goes on cooldown for 30 seconds. Sigils on cooldown have their auras revealed in white, while sigils off cooldown and available to use have their auras revealed in red. Frank cannot use Trespasser to teleport to a sigil that is on cooldown. After a 0.85 second wind-up time, Frank can remotely destroy any unholy sigil on the map that is not on cooldown to return it to him for reuse. When he does, it explodes into Cursed Fire that deals a hell state of damage to any survivor standing in that sigil when it goes off. This has a 10-second cooldown. These sigils are the source of Frank's power, because when I was exploring Augustine's manor, I noticed something that looked a bit familiar. On the floor at the foot of Augustine's altar to the entity, there's this ritual circle, and I realised similar circles full of sigils are dotted around the Cedar Steel Mill in 1980. When Frank attacks, he doesn't just emerge out of nowhere. Green fire bursts out from the ground where his spectral form appears. I thought that seemed like a compelling hook for a power for Frank. The idea of setting up areas ahead of time to either control remotely with a teleport or explode in a burst of spectral flames, yeah, I've made a trap killer, but in my defence, I really wanted to, and I think it works dramatically for Frank. You'll notice I haven't included a mechanic for disarming the sigil safely, but don't worry, I will get to that. But it's time to talk about Frank's kryptonite in the game proper. The camera. In every trial with the Champion, a limited item, the camera, will spawn at the start of the trial. The camera has 3 film charges, and a survivor can use the camera to either destroy a sigil that's setting it off in an action that takes 4 seconds of continuous camera focus, stun the Champion when he is inside a sigil, or during a 3.5 second window after finishing a Trespasser blink. Stunning the killer this way takes 2 seconds of continuous camera focus. Think of it like aiming a flashlight, except you move to first person when you're doing it, like how you switch to first person when using the camera in the original game. Destroying a sigil or stunning the killer with the camera expends 1 film charge, and when all 3 are used, the camera is destroyed and will respawn in 45 seconds. Similar to the lament configuration, a survivor cannot put the camera down once they pick it up, meaning they have to expend all of the charges they want to get rid of it. And if Frank gets too close to the camera when it's on the floor, it will immediately respawn somewhere else. The older players who watch this video might recognise these mechanics from somewhere. Shining an item with limited charges onto a killer's trap to disable it, or onto their body after a blink to stun them. So close, welcome back, light burning nurse and flashlighting away hag traps. These old mechanics were pretty well liked by a lot of skilled players on both sides, but Behaviour got rid of them because it wasn't reasonable to lock killer counterplay behind an item that survivors would have no logical reason to know to bring to the trial. With my gigantic brain, I figured out a way to have it both ways. Attach the same mechanics that people love for hag and nurse to a limited killer item so that the counterplay remains a consistent way to hinder the killer's power, while being able to actually balance around it because it's going to be in every game. But if you've played the casting of Frank Stone, you'll know that the camera is as much a powerful tool in Frank's hands as it is a weapon against him. He will relentlessly pursue anyone who has the camera, because the auric particles contained within the film strips are the means for him to become even more powerful, and that's what Augustine used. So what happens if he gets his hands on it? Let's find out. If Frank downs a survivor carrying the camera, he will smash it, gaining the power of the film inside and accessing his full potential, becoming realised. When Frank is realised, all sigils will continuously explode in 15 seconds, detonating with fire without destroying themselves, and using Trespasser to teleport into or out of a sigil will not put that sigil on cooldown. When Frank becomes realised, the camera will respawn in 15 seconds and Frank will only revert to normal when a survivor stuns him with the camera again. Pulling Frank out of realisation will refund all film charges. And here's a bunch of add-ons to the power as well. Let me know what you think about this. For more or less this game's entire lifetime, Dead by Daylight has been defined as much by its relationship with licensed properties that's crossed over with it, as it has been by the quality of its gameplay and characters. Sometimes a licensed chapter has done the world of good for the game. Until the Halloween chapter dropped, Dead by Daylight was almost dead by December, and high-profile collabs like Silent Hill and Alien have continued to buoy consumer and industry confidence in Dead by Daylight off the back of rough patches in the game's history. But I've been feeling more and more lately that DBD has forgotten how to celebrate what makes the game special, the world and characters and themes that Behaviour have been building on for almost a decade now. I shouldn't be playing Dead by Daylight and feel like Dead by Daylight's universe is playing second fiddle to other people's. It just feels so wrong. And I can't say I haven't fed that in my own way with the Potential and Problem series. I'm not innocent here. More than anything else, the casting of Frank Stone feels like a celebration of Dead by Daylight's original concepts and characters. I never fully understood the criticism among many DBD content creators that the game is too heavy on Easter eggs, because that isn't a criticism you hear for other licensed IPs coming to DVD. I see people getting up in arms about skill checks and generators in Frank Stone, and fair enough if it's immersion breaking, but where's that frustration about busting out a loot and rolling a d20 for bardic inspiration? For half of Wesker's voice lines not making sense and just being quotes from RE5 that have been copy pasted in? Or the actual real life actor Nicolas Cage bumming around in the fog? I'm fine with campy homages and shoutouts, so I don't really care about these elements too much. I just don't understand why so many people seem to take issue with acknowledging the tropes of the game that they ostensibly love, especially when there's a really good thematic reason for most of it beyond just simple fan service. Why do you think I'm not as critical of all the fan service and the wink wink nudge nudge references as most other players? I see Frank Stone being derivative and adhering to tropes, images and formulas that we know from the game, and I smile. Because being derivative of what comes before and giving exactly what we ask for and expect is one of the game's main recurring themes. In a meta-narrative sense, we take on the role of the entity in Augustine's story. Just as Augustine knows what the entity demands of its servants and spends centuries of planning and manipulation to create the perfect servant for it, we know what we expect from a killer. And Supermassive and Behaviour gives it to us exactly, designed in every way to be something that we recognise and understand. The champion is not his own man. He's a compilation of a dozen different stories glued together to make something the entity can accept, and the game that bears his name is exactly the same. It compiles images and themes and settings and fucking sound effects that we already recognise and blends them all together to make something derivative in its familiarity. And that is the genius of Frank Stone. We have so many killers as humanity defines them, and the ones who aren't are defined by how they were never human in the first place. But Frank Stone is not one man. He's the shreds of several different Frank Stones stitched together by the hand of another. Frank Stone was forged for the fog, melted down and casted into the form of a killer like the steel he worked at the Cedar Hills factory. To let him be playable in the game proper wouldn't just be a cool new chapter, it would act as the natural end state of Frank Stone's meta-narrative, and he cannot put a price on that level of thematic satisfaction. Well, except in Auric Cells. The casting of Frank Stone is far from a perfect game. Wow, a DBD project having some deep set issues, colour me surprised on that one. But as a celebration of the game we all love, I can't help but see it as a success. The casting of Frank Stone is a very special piece of the Dead by Daylight universe, and it would feel churlish to keep Frank Stone out of the game that his game showed so much reverence for. Frank Stone deserves his place in the fog. If you were to ask me, I don't think we're going to have to wait very long.